I just don't understand how you find somebody guilty of doing something to a 15-day-old baby, because there was no evidence whatsoever that proved anything about me putting my hands on my kids. I've never done it. I never would.
You know, maybe one stab wound, okay, maybe that's self-defense. But you put in 11 more to make sure he was good and dead. So I hope, I agree with the family. I hope you die in prison as well.
Number 1. The trial of Ariel Castro. Most of it, probably all of it, was consensual, Castro said. These allegations about being forceful on them, that is totally wrong, because there were times where they'd even ask me for it. Many times. And I learned these girls were not virgins. From their testimony to me, they'd multiple partners before me, all 3 of them. The trial of Ariel Castro is one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in recent history. In 2013, the world learned of how Castro kidnapped 3 young women, Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, and held them captive for over a decade in his Cleveland home. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension and emotion. The victims bravely took the stand, recounting their years of captivity, abuse, and torture at the hands of Castro. The details were chilling, as they described how they were chained, starved, beaten, and sexually assaulted on a daily basis. As the courtroom fell silent, Ariel Castro rose to speak at his sentencing hearing. The man who had held 3 young women captive for over a decade, subjecting them to unspeakable horrors, had one last chance to show remorse. But what he said next left everyone in disbelief. With a cold and calculating demeanor, Castro denied all wrongdoing, blaming his victims for his heinous crimes. He claimed that the young women had asked him for sex and that his sexual addiction was to blame for his actions. And if that wasn't enough, he even had the audacity to suggest that the abuse couldn't have been that bad because one of his victims looks normal. As gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom, abuse experts shook their heads in recognition. For them, this kind of language and justification was all too familiar. But for the victims and their families, it was a final slap in the face, a cruel reminder of the years of pain and suffering they had endured at Castro's hands. Castro himself was a formidable figure, appearing calm and collected in court despite the mountain of evidence against him. However, his demeanor began to crack as the prosecution presented their case, revealing the sickening extent of his crimes. The jury was shown photos of the victims' chains and the small, squalid rooms where they were kept, and heard recordings of Castro's taunts and threats. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Castro's defense was weak and that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He eventually pleaded guilty to 937 counts, including kidnapping, rape, and murder, in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without parole. I just wanted to clear the record that I'm not a monster. I did not prey on them. I just acted on my sexual instincts because of my sexual addiction. And, God is my witness, I never beat these women like they are trying to say I did. I never tortured them. Number 2. Jodi Arias trial. The Jodi Arias trial was one of the most riveting courtroom dramas in recent memory. Arias was accused of brutally murdering her ex-boyfriend Travis Alexander in 2008, and the trial quickly became a media sensation. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators eager to witness the proceedings. The prosecution argued that Arias had killed Alexander in a fit of jealousy after he had ended their tumultuous relationship. They presented evidence, including gruesome crime scene photos, bloody clothing, and DNA evidence linking Arias to the murder. Arias, however, maintained her innocence and took the stand in her defense. What followed was a stunning display of drama and deceit, as Arias told a series of elaborate lies to cover up her involvement in the crime. She claimed that she killed Alexander in self-defense after he had attacked her, but the story was riddled with inconsistencies and implausibilities. Throughout the trial, emotions ran high, with family members of the victim and the accused often breaking down in tears or expressing their outrage in the courtroom. At one point, Alexander's sister shouted at Arias from the witness stand, calling her a lying, manipulative, sociopathic demon. The trial was marked by emotional testimony from both sides, as friends and family members of Alexander and Arias took to the stand to testify about their relationship with the accused and the victim. At one point during the trial, Jodi broke down crying. The attorney relentlessly asked her questions in between. Were you crying when you shot him? I don't remember. How about when you cut his throat? I don't know. The judge sentenced Jody to life. The crime was especially cruel. The offense was committed with at least 2 deadly weapons. The crime involved substantial planning. As the trial came to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on first-degree murder charges. Arias was visibly emotional as the verdict was read, and many in the courtroom wept openly. Number 3. Christopher McNabb. The Christopher McNabb trial was a heart-wrenching and shocking courtroom drama that captured the attention of the nation. McNabb was accused of murdering his 15-day-old baby girl Kalia McNabb in a vicious fit of rage, sending shockwaves throughout the community of Newton County, Georgia. As the trial began, the prosecution presented a compelling case against McNabb. They argued that McNabb had become enraged when his baby wouldn't stop crying and had violently shaken her to death. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of whom were brought to tears by the graphic evidence and emotional testimony presented during the trial. Witnesses described the horrific injuries sustained by Kalia, including skull fractures and brain swelling, which were allegedly inflicted by McNabb's violent actions. The defense team, however, tried to paint a different picture of McNabb, arguing that he was a devoted father who would never harm his child. They pointed to inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and suggested that other potential suspects should be considered. As the trial progressed, tensions ran high, with both sides fighting tooth and nail to prove their case. McNabb himself was emotional, at times breaking down in tears as he listened to the evidence against him. "I'm innocent. I didn't do this. I would never do this." The judge asked Christopher what sentence he hoped his child's murderer would get. He replied with the maximum full sentence, giving a life sentence to himself. Number 4. Camille Gomet trial. The Camille Gomet trial was a shocking and riveting legal drama that captivated audiences across the nation. Gomet was accused of murdering her boyfriend Marcel Hill in a violent and jealous rage in their Jackson, Michigan home. The prosecution presented a compelling case against Gomet, depicting her as a violent and abusive partner who had repeatedly attacked Hill in the past. Witnesses testified to seeing Gomet physically assault Hill on numerous occasions, including kicking and punching him and threatening to kill him. The defense, however, sought to paint a different picture of Gomet, arguing that she was a victim of domestic abuse herself and that she had acted in self-defense. They presented evidence of Hill's history of drug use and domestic violence and suggested that Gomet's actions were justified under the circumstances. As the trial unfolded, tensions ran high in the courtroom, with both sides presenting emotional and at times graphic testimony. Gomet herself was often emotional, frequently breaking down in tears as she listened to the evidence against her. In the end, the jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on multiple charges, including first-degree murder. Gomet was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing a sense of justice to the family and friends of Marcel Hill. "The way I was portrayed, everything was a lie," she said. During the sentencing, Gomet repeatedly interrupted the judge and showed no remorse. Number 5. Ignacio Rodriguez. Ignacio Rodriguez's trial is one of the most captivating legal dramas in recent years. The case had all the elements of a blockbuster courtroom thriller: a wealthy and powerful defendant, a gruesome crime, and a team of tenacious prosecutors determined to bring the perpetrator to justice. The trial centered around the murder of Maria Gomez, a young woman who had been working as a housekeeper for Rodriguez's family. Gomez was found dead in the family's mansion, brutally beaten and strangled to death. The evidence against Rodriguez was damning. His DNA was found at the scene of the crime, and he had been seen arguing with Gomez on the night of her murder. Despite this, Rodriguez maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that he had been framed by someone who had access to his DNA. His defense team presented a variety of alternate suspects, including the victim's ex-boyfriend and a disgruntled former employee of Rodriguez's company. The trial lasted for several weeks, during which time the courtroom was packed with spectators and journalists eager to witness the high-stakes drama unfold. The prosecution presented a compelling case, with expert witnesses and forensic evidence that seemed to leave little doubt about Rodriguez's guilt. However, the defense team was equally formidable, aggressively cross-examining witnesses and presenting a persuasive argument that their client was a victim of a conspiracy. In the end, the jury was tasked with deciding whether the evidence against Rodriguez was strong enough to prove his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. After several days of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict, and Rodriguez was sentenced to life in prison. The trial of Ignacio Rodriguez was a gripping and emotional rollercoaster, with twists and turns at every stage. It demonstrated the power of the legal system to hold even the most privileged and wealthy members of society accountable for their actions, and highlighted the tireless efforts of those working to ensure justice for victims of violent crimes.